So today on YouTube, I'm going to show you how to put together one of these. Hey guys, it's the other Jason here from 3D Printing Canada. And I'm going to kind of redo with an add-on video that we have done before. So actually trying to help a customer out over the weekend and trying to find a definitive put together video of the Ditton Aero Hotend, paying special attention to some of the characteristics when you're putting this together that you do have to be careful of. I couldn't find one, so I decided our camera crew is in today. Thank you, Jaron. I said, well, if Jaron's here and I have some time, I'm going to go put one together and I'm going to show some of the detail that I think is important when you're putting it together that needs to be pointed out in a much more explicit form. So typically this is just a standard Ditton Aero Hotend with a standard block and nozzle. The customer that I'm actually going to be putting this Hotend together for wants a volcano. So I don't have to change anything on this kit except for the block and the nozzle. So if I look at the replacement block and nozzle, you will notice that these units are taller, and they're taller for the explicit reason of being able to increase your print speed. So with that print speed, you need a longer melt zone for your filament that's built into your machine. So that's what the volcano is doing. It's giving you that longer melt zone so that you can move into some faster speeds. It doesn't eliminate detail, doesn't eliminate, it doesn't change any of the characteristics of the head. You may have to modify your retraction slightly, although I would still recommend doing the retraction tests across your machine after you've changed this out or after you've installed it. The other thing that I'm going to do with this for this customer, because this is going in a production machine, the original Ditton comes with the plastic lever for changing your filament. We are going to change this one out to the aluminum upgrade. Not something that's required to do, and it's not like you install it and the lever fails the second day. This particular customer just wanted to have it installed right off the bat. So we're going to say thank you very much, and it gives us a chance to show you one of the upgrades as well. So with no further ado, I'm going to step out and start putting this machine together, or start putting the head together. All right, so what we're going to start doing is we're going to start assembling this head. I have just a random bracket here. This particular one is actually off a Modex machine. It's not what it's going on, but it's what I'm going to use for the assembly portion of this video. So when we're putting these together, you will generally need some kind of an adapter bracket or a bracket to be able to mount this up on your machine. So at any point in time when you're doing this, your bracket's going to go on first, and then you're going to use the plastic, I guess the back bracket, for lack of a better term on it. In this bracket, there is going to be a small bearing or bushing back here in the back end. This bearing is actually going to sit the 66 tooth gear, the back half of the gear that's on here. When we're putting the front plate on here, the cooling tower, when we put this on here, there's going to be another bearing in the front sitting in this aluminum shield. And then there's going to be a bolt that goes straight through, which bolts it onto the motor itself. When we're putting these in, we have to make sure that these are aligned properly, and the tension on these bolts is one of the specific things that I actually want to bring everybody's attention to at this point. So when we're putting this together, we're going to take our rear bracket, we're going to lay it on in place over top of our mounting plate and our stepper motor. In the very back lower corner down here, I'm going to grab a pointing stick. Down here in this corner, there is a mounting hole. This is going to be the only hole that you're actually going to use to mount this up at the moment. What I am going to do is I'm going to grab a 35mm bolt. I'm going to put it through the opposite hole. And this is going to be simply for alignment purposes only. When I'm putting this in, this is the only bolt, the one down in this, your right corner. The lower right corner is going to be the only bolt that actually holds this together throughout the rest of the process until we finish putting the top plate in. So we're going to work on getting this one in. And that is going to be located in the extruder kit. Now, in this extruder kit, you're going to find a couple of things here that are very important for you to note. There's a screw, a couple of Allen keys, spring. There's this washer, which I don't think anybody really brings nearly enough attention to, but it's a small washer and it looks like it's got fingers on the inside. Those fingers are actually going to play a rather important role that not anybody gives enough attention to during the assembly of these machines. So as I'm doing this, I'm going to line up my bracket, line up my back plate, and once I get all that lined up, I can get that lower right bolt in place. The lower right bolt that's in here, you can snug it, and because I've got another bolt in the opposite corner, it's going to keep all of my holes aligned. So I can tighten this down fairly well. Try not to over tighten, and by over tighten, you don't want to tighten it enough where you're actually going to break this back plane. So it is going to go in there with a fair bit of force, not a lot. So the next portion to this is we're actually going to put the drive gear on. Now the drive gear is located in the Titan bag right hand, which I actually believe I forgot to mention to you up until this point. These Titans are available in a left hand and a right hand side. So if you're looking at this, our nozzle or our extruder is going to come down on this side. This is a right-hand unit. The left-hand unit, or the mirrored, as it's mentioned at some points, will come down so that the extruder is basically in the opposite location. So if you're putting one on the left and one on the right, most people want to have the two extruders as close together as you can. With the two of those being close together, your offsets are a little less, your chances for things coming out of alignment are going to be a little less. So pay attention to if you want a right hand or a left hand extruder unit. You can get them in both, and there is no difference in price, I don't believe. So the next part that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to put the grub screw. There's a small grub screw that's located in that extruder's kit bag with the smallest Allen key, which is 1.5 mil. You're going to take that, put it in the side of your gear. Once you get your extruder gear in there, on this shaft, there is a flat spot. I'll get my pointing stick out again. On this extruder, on this NEMA motor, there's a flat spot. This extruder gear is going to go on so that the grub screw itself that we've just installed, so the grub screw on the gear is going to come in contact with the flat portion of the stepper motor. Now, at this time, you're going to want to grab your 66 tooth gear and just lay it in place. Lay it in so that the teeth mesh and it is seated all the way to the back of the machine. So when this gear is installed, you're gonna seat it through that bearing that you saw in here in the back. You're going to have it mounted all the way to the rear. What you're looking for is for this gear, the face of this gear, and the face of this gear to be level. Now in this particular case, I'm a little low on the drive gear versus the large gear. So I'm going to take this large gear off and bring it up so it's in a little better alignment again. The reason why the alignment on this is so important is because you want to get as full an engagement of this gear to the 66 tooth as possible. If you end up setting it up so that it's a little low, what happens is the force on this stepper motor is only being applied against half the teeth of this larger gear. So you're going to end up wearing it out much quicker. My alignment there is almost perfect. I'm just going to bring it up maybe another ½ millimeter. Now that the surface of the large gear and the surface of the Titan are exactly the same. So from here, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to assemble, move this out here a little, we're going to assemble, this is what I refer to as the cooling tower or the cooling fins. So when we put this together, there's going to be a couple of parts that we're going to require. We're going to require our block, our nozzle. We are going to need our throat. And they are going to go together in this orientation. So this is probably the most critical part of when you're putting this machine together, because when this throat and nozzle go together, they have to touch each other, and actually they get torqued together or heat tightened, so they're actually putting force on each other inside the block and they will not separate. If you get a ½ millimeter or a millimeter of gap between these two, it will cause heat creep and it will cause jams in your machine. So in preparation for getting all of this together, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set my throat into my cooling tower. So in the kit, it does give you a heat sink compound. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this compound. I'm using the Slice Engineering one here. The only reason why I'm using the Slice Engineering compound and not the one that comes with it is because I'm leaving this for my customer to have as a spare. They're both basically, they'll serve the same purpose. This is obviously a little higher quality. They're both very similar. If you have heat compound, is heat compound. So I just put a little small bit on the threads. Cap it back up again so that it doesn't dry out on you. Spread it through using my fingers. However, when you're done with that, wipe it off your fingers. Now, you're going to take your throat, you're going to thread it into the cooling tower, and you're going to thread it all the way in until it bottoms out. Once it bottoms out, you can wipe off your little bit of extra compound that you have on there. And all you should see outside of the cooling tower is just where this thins out on the heat break, right here. If you see any thread from your heat break into your cooling tower, there's something in that cooling tower that's preventing your heat break from threading all the way down. Once in a while, sometimes it's a little machining mark or a little bit of aluminum, a little fray of aluminum or something that's in there. Or if you're disassembling and putting it back together, it may be a melted piece of plastic or something that's in there. But when you're putting this together, visually check that this thin part of your brake is level with your cooling tower as you're putting it together. So the next part you're going to do is you're going to look at your, again, this heating block is the Volcano version. So if we look back at the original, this is how it's going to go together orientation-wise. The Volcanos go together with this notch towards the top. So the nozzle is going to go in from the bottom. So once we put this nozzle in, here's one of the most critical parts to these machines. When this nozzle goes in, thread it in all the way and then unthread it or back it out about a full turn. So what you're going to notice is there's going to be a gap that's going to develop between the back end of this nozzle and the bottom face of this block. And that gap is going to be about 2 to 3 thou. I have I have a 10 thou gauge here. So this gauge goes in and has a fair bit of space in here. Just to show you what this will look like at 10 thou, you can't see any air. At least I can't see any air between here and here with it tightened down on this. So I will back it off so that I can at least see a little bit of gap in there. So if you want to try and visualize it a little bit, maybe a piece of paper. Should be able to slide a piece of paper between the nozzle and the block. Next, what you're going to do as you're assembling this together is you're going to want to install your heater cartridge. So your heater cartridge is going to go in the front hole, and I usually pull it over into the notch that's in the front of the block. And I'm going to pull out the black grub screw, which is also going to be a 1.5 millimeter. And then I'm going to insert that in the small hole on the side of the block. Now, once I feel contact of that grub screw to the thermistor cartridge, I continue to tighten it about another 1/4 turn. That's it. Bear in mind that this heater cartridge, you don't want to crush it, because if you crush it or deform it, you'll never be able to get it out of this block and change it. You just want to be able to tighten that grub screw down enough so it holds it, but not deform it or prevent it from ever coming out. So for this, I'm just going to start these 2 screws in here for the heater cartridge. Then when we pull the heater cartridge out of our kit, it is going to have a fairly long wire on it. So it's meant that you can really put this in any application that you may need it for. But also, if this happens to be too long for your application, you can also trim it and cut it down a little bit as well if it's too much. Again, we're looking at the notch here as the top. We already have our nozzle in the bottom, thermistor's installed. Now we're going to install our cartridge. Put our cartridge in, and then actually fold the wire over 90 degrees into that little bit of a pocket on the top of the block. So we're trying to keep it as flat as we can. Now, when I'm tightening up these screws, I snug them down so they're in contact with the block. Now, I can still move and pull out this heater cartridge out of this block. All I do is take 1/4 turn, quarter turn, still moves, two more 1/4 turns, and that cartridge is not coming out of there at all. That's where you would leave it. Do not tighten it up any more than that, because again, you'll run into the same problem. You won't be able to get the heater cartridge out. So once all that's installed, you can spin on your cooling tower. Keep your finger on your nozzle so your nozzle's not moving. Thread this down until you think it's hit the end of the nozzle. Now, here's the trick to it. I think this has touched the nozzle right now because I can't get it to thread in anymore. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use my wrench. I'm going to back that nozzle out 1/2 turn, 1/4 turn, and I should be able to now thread this in an additional 1/2 to 3/4 of a turn. That tells me that this throat and the nozzle are both in contact with each other. So now all we're going to worry about is alignment. On this particular application, I'm going to want the thermistor towards the front, and I'm going to want the heater cartridge towards the back. So I'm going to loosen up this nozzle, position the block where I want it to be, and then I can tighten that nozzle down, and nothing will move at that point. Here's the critical parts to this. Number one, after you get this mounted in your machine and you get this fired up for the first time, if you're normally printing PLA PET G, you're gonna use this at about 230, 235. You're gonna wanna heat this up to about the 250 range, and at the 250 range, you're gonna wanna do a heat tighten on it. So let's pretend that it's mounted in your machine for a moment. You're gonna wanna grab it with a wrench, with a heater block wrench. So with this mounted in the machine, you're gonna heat this up to 250. You're gonna grab your block with a wrench, and at 250, you're gonna take this nozzle and you're gonna tighten it just another 1/8 of a turn, no more. If you tighten this up too much, you will snap off the top of the nozzle, but you're gonna wanna do just another 1/8 of a turn after it's mounted in the machine. Without that being done, I am gonna show you where the critical distances are. If you wanna zoom in a little bit, we can have a quick look. Your distance between the nozzle and the block is going to be approximately the width of a piece of paper, maybe a little more. It will adjust a little bit based on where this block ends up in orientation to this. You should have a fairly comfortable gap here, maybe 4 to 5 millimeters between the block and the cooling tower. And the only thing that should be visible in between is just the throat, the part with no threads. You may see the top end of the thread on the block, that's okay. But the distance of that throat should be the distance that's actually in this tower. The last part to this is once this is actually tightened up and once this is set in place properly, the heat tighten is done. You can grab this block with your wrench and give it just an extra little turn to lock it into here. Because remember, we've only finger tightened that throat up into the block. So you're gonna wanna grab that block and just give it a little bit of a push just to make sure that it's set nicely in the back of the block. Back to our stepper motor. The next thing we're gonna do is we're going to install our lever arm. Our lever arm is going to go in so that the ball bearing rides against the hobbed gear set on our 66 tooth gear. Then we're going to get our knob, our screw, our spring, and our nut. So you're going to put the nut on first. Oh, sorry, we don't need the spring on this one because the spring is already on the gear. So this is the spring that we would have put on if we were using the plastic one. So this bolt will basically just flip inside of the spring and it will sit wholly inside of this black notch at the top. So bear in mind, when you're doing the tension adjustment on these, when you're tightening the screw, you're actually loosening the tension on this arm. When you're loosening the bolt, you're pushing the nut in. So you're loosening the nut, and as you're loosening it, you can watch, you're actually putting more tension on the spring. So it's a little bit of a backwards thought. So you're loosening the knob to apply more tension onto the hobbed gear. So I'm going to loosen this up all the way because it will make it easier feeding filament and things like that through it. So finally, we are on to getting the PTFE tube and liner into this. Now, in your kit, you will find a small piece of PTFE tube, and you're going to find two what they call guide tubes. The bottom of the guide tubes are going to be marked. I'm going to hold this so you may be able to see them in the light. One is going to be marked 285, 285R for a right hand, and 175R for a 1.75 millimeter filament. One's obviously 3 mil, one's the 175. The 285, you don't need a liner in it. We're not going to use it in this because this particular configuration is going to be a 175, so I'm going to set that aside. The 175 guide tube is going to require some filament down through here. I'm going to link in this video. I've done a very quick tube cutter guide for these Titan arrows. The length of the PTFE tube is actually going to be 23 millimeter. So I've got a little guide that if you lay the tube in it and just cut it off at the mark, it is 23 millimeter. You'll see that down below. However, I will show you how to do it if you don't have the ability to use that or don't have it to print it right now. So if you take this tube, cut off maybe an inch of it. When you put this in your guide tube and you lay it in here, the square part of your guide tube is going to go towards the cooling tower. And you can see that when I push that all the way down, I have a gap in here. So what you want to do is you want to do it so that the bottom of this black and the top of this aluminum touch, but the PTFE tube takes up the entire gap. So I always just cut it a little long and then just creep down to where you need it to be so that it sits properly in the assembly. Yeah. So my guide tube is there. I can feel it's just touching the top of the cooling, just touching the top of this, and my PTFE tube is taking up the entire gap inside. So that being said, once this is on your machine, now you're going to mate the two of them together. So this guide tube is going to come inside this little notch down here at the bottom. Let me get my pointing stick again. So the guide tube that we have is actually going to fit inside this square notch that's inside this machine here, inside the black plastic gear. And the one last thing that we have to install is the gear or the bearing that goes over top of the 66 tooth gear. You can install the bearing here or here. I find it easier if I actually just put it on here and then it'll go together. And just like that, it all slides in. So when you're looking at this before you start screwing things down, make sure your seam here at the back of the tower to the black part right here, make sure this seam here is aligned and they're meeting. There's no gap in between. And the same thing over here on this side, your aluminum and your black part here, there should be no gap between the two. This is the way your head's going to go together. Now, I generally will grab the bolts that do this one and this one, or the one opposite the 66 tooth gear. I will do these two bolts first, because these bolts are going all the way through the entire assembly and going right back to the stepper motor. I've had to use a couple of longer ones in this, simply because I know what the distances and that are in them. This bracket's a little thicker than most. So when I do this one with the blue Loctite, I use this gear, or this lock washer, and I put it on here. This is the bolt that goes through the 66 tooth gear. When I put this in and tighten this down, this bolt, when it bottoms out, once I feel tension starting to come up on that bolt, I stop. Don't apply any more tension to it than that, because those little teeth that are on the inside of the washer, between the Loctite on the end of the bolt and the teeth on the inside of the washer, that's what's going to keep this bolt in place. It's not meant to have a great amount of force applied to it this way. Otherwise, what happens, remember there's a gear located just inside of this housing here, right in here. This was the last bearing we installed. And there's a bearing on the other side of this shaft, just back inside of this plastic. If we apply excessive force with them coming this way, those bearings are going to wear prematurely. They're only about $2 to $3 to replace the bearings. The problem is you have to take the whole head apart and sometimes parts of the machine apart to be able to get this head out and actually disassemble it to replace the bearings. When the bearings start to go, you will find sometimes it will extrude and then stop and extrude and stop. It's not necessarily predictable as to why you're getting under extrusion, and this is generally the reason. Once this head assembly is together at this point, you should be able to grab that 66 tooth gear, and you should be able to rotate it, not freely, but you'll be able to feel basically just the tension in the motor pushing back at you. If it's hard to move, or if it's skipping or not smooth, then you've got something in here is not put together correctly, so you're going to want to take it apart and see what's misaligned. More than likely it's one of these bolts are too tight, or this one here is too tight pushing into the bearing caps. Finally, the last one is the one down here. Now this one you have to be careful of. In this hole here, when we're putting this in, bear in mind the bolt that you're actually going to put in here only comes out to a brass nut at the back. So you have to make sure you grab the bolt that only goes as far as the brass nut, but no further. Put that in there. We can tighten it down, and that's it. So it looks like there's a little bit of gap in between right here. It's actually not. It's a little bit of a slot that's in the black plastic. If you look behind it, I'm in full contact here with the plastic, and I'm in full contact along here with the cooling tower. So everything is aligning straight and square. Again, double check, make sure everything is spinning freely. The only thing left to do at this point is you have to install your cooling fan. Your cooling fan is going to install on here, and it has the tapered screws to be able to install that on there. Install that as you see fit. But for right now, just putting the Titan Aero together properly, making sure that you have all proper clearances and everything in place, this is what I wanted to get through to with you today. After all this is put together and done, you can still put your sock and everything else on. I have a couple of rules of thumb. I don't put the sock on until after it's installed in the machine and it's been heat tightened. It's a flag for me so that I don't forget to do it. Everybody's going to have their own little processes and whatnot as to what's easiest for them to do it. However, with this here, this is the most critical part of it. With this head, again, there's a lot of videos of how to put these together online, but there's not a lot of them that are specific enough to show the clearances here that you're looking for, the clearances here that you're looking for, which bolts and what their purposes are, which is the point that I wanted to get through to you guys today. So I very much appreciate your time. I appreciate your patience in watching me go through and do it. Like and subscribe. Again, it's the other Jason from 3D Printing Canada. And thank you very much, guys. Have a great day.